Today I have the opportunity of introducing Dr. E.J. Dionne Jr. E.J. is a Washington Post columnist who researches and writes on a range of issues that include elections, polling, the role of media in politics, and the role of religion in public life. A nationally known and respected commentator on politics, Dionne appears weekly on National Public Radio and regularly on MSNBC. He also has appeared on NewsHour with Jim Lehrer and on PBS programs. A prolific author and editor, his most recent book is Why the Right Went Wrong: Conservatism from Goldwater to the Tea Party and Beyond. If you are a policy wonk, and I assume that you are by your presence here today, I encourage you to follow EJ on Twitter. His handle is @EJDionne. Dr. Dionne also serves as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy. To say that he is beloved by his students there would be an understatement. I had the pleasure of taking Professor Dionne's public policy and media course this last semester, and on some of the days, it was literally standing room only. The class, of course, was the educational opportunity of a lifetime. But beyond that, throughout our time together, Professor Dionne went out of his way to be helpful to his students in whatever way he could, whether it was by making resource recommendations or introductions to contacts from a variety of fields and political leanings. We've invited Dr. Dionne here today to discuss the intersection of media and public policy. In other words, we've asked him to condense his Georgetown course to 20 minutes or 25. So enjoy the free education, and there will be a brief opportunity for questions following his remarks. Please join me in welcoming E.J. Dionne to the lectern.
I'd like to have permission to cede the rest of my time to Melissa for a longer introduction. What a wonderful, wonderful introduction. And it is one of the joys of teaching is that you get to meet, and particularly here in Washington, is you get to meet extraordinary students doing extraordinary things. And Melissa is one of the central reasons I am here today, although there are others. I do want to say that that was much nicer than an introduction I once got when I was giving a speech out of town. It was an unintentionally difficult introduction. It ended, and now, for the latest dope from Washington, here's E.J. Dionne. So, Melissa, bless you for that. I am honored to be here because of Melissa, first and foremost. I'm also honored to be here because of the Adventist Church. And I suppose they and I don't agree on every single issue, but over a long period of time, the Adventists have really been very powerful advocates for the religious liberty, including the religious liberty of those who have nothing whatsoever to do with their church. They've been particularly strong on religious liberty at work. And I am grateful to my friend Melissa Rogers, who many of you probably know, who's now head of President Obama's faith-based office, who first introduced me to the work of the church, and I am here to honor them. I'm also here to honor the Religious Freedom Center here at the museum. It has done extraordinary work in keeping this issue at the fore, and it has, as this program suggests, been extraordinarily open to lots of different viewpoints on this issue. And this is a subject on which we tend not to be open enough to each other. One of the things I do want to talk about is that religious liberty actually requires both empathy and humility. Now, I do want to say, and I'm going to have more to say about humility, but having a columnist and a pundit talk about humility is a bit like the manager of the meat department at your supermarket recommending vegetarianism. There just seems to be something at odds. And I do want you to know that our readers keep us humble if we pay attention to them. I don't know if you've noticed in newspapers these days, there are lots and lots of comments underneath. We also get tweeted back at, we get emails. There are many of them that I could not repeat in this polite company. But my favorite began, "Dear Mr. Dionne, are you as dumb in person?" And I always like to begin talks with that particular email because you may get nothing out of my talk, but at least you'll be able to answer that question for self. I also, if you will forgive me, I recently found a Calvinist joke, which I want to tell, which has some relevance. I had to give a talk up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which, as you know, is the center of the Dutch Reformed Church in our country. Now, it's a tricky punchline, so stay with me. It's the Calvinist gets to the gates of heaven, and there are two lines, and one says predestined, and the other says free will. Religious liberty all the way to the top. And the Calvinist, of course, gets into the predestined line. And then an angel comes up to the Calvinist and says, "What are you doing in this line?" And the Calvinist says, "Well, I chose it." And of course, the angel said, "No, you belong in the free will line." So the Calvinist goes over to the free will line, and then another angel comes up to him and says, "What are you doing in the free will line?" And very grumpily, he looks at the angel and said, "Somebody told me I had to be here." I think that's a religiously sophisticated joke. The other thing is, I want to talk today about media, but I understand that in your own conversations, and even in our conversation at the table here during lunch, our debates in the United States over religious liberty have so much to do with how we witness to the world on this question. And I want to talk about the interaction between those. And you've also already heard from an excellent panel with a number of my great colleagues on it. Just a moment ago, Lynn Sweet, Clarence Page, Doyle McManus, and is it Mr. David Cook from the Christian Science Monitor. I feel like being inspired by David Cook, who at the end said that newspapers are interested in positive, happy, uplifting stuff. I hope I can give you that. But they mentioned Twitter a lot, and thank you for mentioning my Twitter feed. These days in American politics, the rule seems to be I tweet, therefore I am. And it is a Donald Trump joke. We have to have one Donald Trump joke. And it's a religious joke. And it was actually courtesy of my colleague, Carlos Lozada at the Post. And if you remember, Donald Trump tangled a bit with Pope Francis. And Carlos was trying to figure out what other fight is Trump going to pick now, or is he going to have now? And so he sent out an imaginary Donald Trump tweet, which began, "It took him 3 days to rise. I would have done it in 3 hours." And then, of course, the inevitable Jesus period, very weak period. So this is a very interesting year. When we talk about the press's interest and concern, let me just say one other set of thank yous, which is, I do want to say thank you to my friend Melissa Rogers, a couple other people in the administration whom, as you know, have been deeply involved in this issue, who are people I worked with years before they went to the administration, Rabbi David Saperstein and Sean Casey at the State Department. I also want to say thanks to my friend Richard Fulton of the American Jewish Committee, and we've done a lot of work over the years, and my friend Mike Cromarty, who was head of the International Religious Freedom Commission under President Bush. Mike is one of those people with whom I have certain areas of warm agreement, certain areas of warm disagreement, but we've done a lot of work together over the years. And I want to salute Frank Wolf, who spoke earlier, who's been involved in this issue for a long, long time. In terms of press coverage, well, it's pretty easy. The press loves to cover really bad stuff. So when some truly catastrophic thing is happening, it tends to, and we saw this with the Yazidis, we see it in particular circumstances. You don't have to worry, the press will be there to cover the catastrophe. When it's really divisive stuff, you don't have to worry. We in the media love to cover really divisive stuff. It's interesting, it grabs people's attention, and in our defense, it involves often very important arguments about principle that we have with each other, sometimes with the rest of the world. What we tend not to cover nearly enough is what this conference, as I see it, is all about, which is areas where we are trying to build consensus across a lot of the lines that normally divide us, whether they are religious lines or political lines. In some ways, my only qualification to be here today is that I am an American who has been blessed, as we all have, by the First Amendment and by our religious liberty provided there. But I think that one of your challenges, one of the challenges of all people who care about this issue, is to get everyone more interested in the moments when we can come together, when we can stand up for common principles. But we have trouble even figuring out what those common principles are. I teach a class, as Melissa kindly mentioned, on religion and American politics. And one of my favorite questions for my students is, are the two clauses of the Liberty Amendment complementary, or are they in conflict? And I think when you look at our own public life, we often see those phrases as being in conflict. Now, I think through our history, we have worked out that non-establishment and free exercise can work together. Most of the time, we have made that work. But one of the big arguments in the United States right now, and I think it has a bearing on how we present the argument for religious liberty to the world, is at what point does separation get in the way of free exercise? Many of my conservative friends often say that advocates of separation are trying to drive religion out of the public square, that they are trying to limit the area in which people can express their religious freedom. And so I think one of the questions that we have to work out is, how do these two work together? My friend and colleague, the late Jean Elshtain, once offered one thought that I think was extremely helpful as we think about religious liberty. She argued that the separation of church and state is one thing, but that is different from the separation of religion and politics. The first is designed to protect the liberty of all of us, even though with all the religious liberty lawyers in the room, I want to point out, I know separation is not in the First Amendment and comes from the letter to the Danbury Baptists by Thomas Jefferson. But I think that the protecting liberty is different. Protecting liberty from the coercive power of the state is different from the right of people to bring their religious convictions to the public square. Anyone who is serious about their religious beliefs is going to have their views in the public square affected by them. I once debated Ralph Reed of the Christian Coalition, and I said in the course of my talk that I will always defend Ralph's right to base his political conclusions in part or in whole on his religious beliefs, because that's what has happened to me. I like to confound people by saying I'm a liberal because I am a Catholic, which not everybody sees as clearly, although Pope Francis has been very helpful to us on that front of late. Bless him. By the way, I love Pope Francis for many reasons, but one of them is that in one of his very early documents, he condemns sourpusses. He's got to be the only pope in history who said that being a sourpuss is a bad thing. And I was very curious about the translation of that, and somebody at U.S. Catholic, the magazine, looked it up, and the way it was in the Spanish, which may be the way he wrote it, was "don't be vinegar-faced." So I have taken it as a personal mission not to be a vinegar-faced sourpuss in my life. But what I said is about Ralph is that, I will always defend your right to base your political conclusions in part on your faith, because that's what I've done all my life. But then I did ask Ralph to explain to me where Jesus called for a cut in the capital gains tax, because I simply couldn't find it in my scripture. And so I think that one of the issues is, how do you define robust religious freedom? What is the role of religious people in a polity? It is not simply their right to worship. It is not simply their right to observe the Sabbath on the day that they choose something Adventists are very alive to. It's also what is the role of religion in the public square. We were having a lively conversation. It's odd that religious liberty these days so often comes down to the question, what should the florist and the baker do? And it's extraordinary that in some ways, that we have allowed the discussion to be confined there. And we had a vigorous exchange on the issue of the florist and the bakers providing a public accommodation and therefore being obligated to cater gay weddings versus this as a form of expressive speech. I come down in favor of strong religious exemptions for religious groups, but I would draw the line before the florist and baker. I think it is a public accommodation, but I get the alternative point of view. But there is something very troubling that when we talk about religious liberty these days, we think immediately of the florist and the baker, or we think of the contraception mandate in the healthcare law and exactly how that should work. This conference is about international religious freedom, which is literally a matter of life or death for so many people around the world. And I think that if we allow our culture wars to narrow and define what is meant by religious liberty, we lose our power to witness, and I think we weaken our witness in the world. I don't like culture wars. I don't like culture wars because I think when you think of culture war politics, they tend to be about exploiting our discontents and our division, when I believe the task of democratic politics is to try to heal them. Whichever side people are on in the culture war, it often seems to come down to finding ways of using the state to enforce a particular view of the world that we have. Now, some of that is inevitable. You cannot separate morality from law, and Lord knows those of us who are friends of civil rights, when we heard Dr. Martin Luther King preach, were indeed arguing for the idea that the law must embody a vision of morality. But I do get trouble that we are losing any capacity we have, as Doug Laycock once talked about, to live and let live on these questions. And I think that organizations like this, like the Religious Freedom Center, might help us down that road. There are two presidents I would like to quote, and I am going to be thoroughly bipartisan in this, not because one should be bipartisan, sometimes one shouldn't be bipartisan, but because I think that both President Obama and President George W. Bush offered two important lessons on how we witness for religious freedom. I'll go first to President Bush. Those of you who read my column know I was a Bush critic. I was a fairly consistent Bush critic. Indeed, my conservative friends say, and they're probably right, I have still not gotten over Florida. So I confess that to you all today. But I think that one of the truly finest moments of George W. Bush's presidency was that moment after 9/11 when he visited the Islamic Center in Washington, D.C. Think about the state we were in as a country. We were shaken, we were shocked, we were angry. And there was a great danger that we would take the legitimate anger we felt over this horrible attack and turn it on our fellow citizens who are Muslims. George W. Bush, right at the beginning, right in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, went to the Islamic Center, and here are among the things he said. He said, when we think of Islam, we think of a faith that brings comfort to 1 billion people around the world. Billions of people find comfort and solace and peace, and that's made brothers and sisters out of every race, America counts millions of Muslims among our citizens, and Muslims make an incredibly valuable contribution to our country. Muslims are doctors, lawyers, law professors, members of the military, entertainers, shopkeepers, moms and dads, and they need to be treated with respect. In our anger and emotion Our fellow Americans must treat each other with respect. He went on, this is a great country. It's a great country because we share the same values of respect and dignity and human worth, and it is my honor to be meeting with leaders who feel just the same as I do. They're outraged, they're sad. They love America just as much as I do. I think we are missing that voice in parts of our politics these days. A lot of people have said, and I think there's some truth to this, that those of us who are on the liberal side have not paid enough attention to the persecution of Christians around the world. I think the administration has taken some steps recently, but I do think we have to stand up for the religious liberty of everyone, and that does include Christians. But our voice will be diluted, our voice will be less powerful as a country if we forget what George W. Bush said on that day after 9/11. And I think we have other voices out there. I won't be partisan, but there are other voices out there saying things quite different from what President Bush said, and I hope we repair to that. The other person I want to quote is President Obama. I don't know, let me just ask, how many of you have ever sat down and read President Obama's call to renewal speech way back in 2006? You've got a treat ahead of you. I think, there you go. My friend Harvey Cox, my old religion teacher. That call to renewal speech, I think, is one of the most balanced and thoughtful statements by a politician about how we should think about religious questions at home, and by extension, how we should think of them around the world. I won't quote the entire speech, but here's what I particularly liked about what President Obama said 10 years ago when he was a senator. He was trying, on the one hand, to argue to progressives that they need to take religion seriously and they need to respect religious people. I sometimes refer to myself as a pro-religion liberal. Now, many liberals would be offended by that the way conservatives are offended by having to be called compassionate conservative. They argue, why do you need that adjective? And so why are liberals automatically assumed to be anti-religion, so you need the prefix? But I think, I've thought about what do I mean when I say I'm a pro-religion liberal, and I think it is to have a leaning to focus on the ways in which religious faith and religious traditions have contributed to the world, to the common good, to love, to our mutual understanding, rather than to focus only on the ways in which our religious traditions have done exactly the opposite of that. And I think sometimes some of my friends are so skeptical of religion that they overlook its contribution. President Obama that day specifically took progressives to task for taking that view. He said, when we ignore the debate about what it means to be a good Christian or Muslim or Jew, when we discuss religion only in the negative sense of where or how it should not be practiced, rather than in the positive sense of what it tells us about our obligations toward one another, when we shy away from religious venues and religious broadcasts because we assume that we will be unwelcome, others will fill the vacuum, those with the most insular views of faith or those who cynically use religion to justify partisan ends. The discomfort of some progressives with any hint of religion has often prevented us from effectively addressing issues in moral terms. Imagine Lincoln's second inaugural address without reference to the judgments of the Lord, or King's I Have a Dream speech without references to all of God's children. Their summoning of a higher truth helped inspire what had seemed impossible and move the nation to embrace a common destiny. Our failure as progressives to tap into the moral underpinnings of the nation is not just rhetorical, though. Our fear of getting preachy may also lead us to discount the role that values and culture play in some of our most urgent social problems. So that was his lecture to his fellow progressives. But then he also argued that people of strong faith, particularly conservative people of strong faith, needed to accept the religious diversity of our nation, something, again, I salute the Adventists for consistently doing. Obama went on, while I've already laid out some of the work that progressive leaders need to do, I want to talk a little bit about what conservative leaders need to do, some truths they need to acknowledge. For one, they need to understand the critical role that separation of church and state has played in preserving not only our democracy, but the robustness of our religious practice. Folks tend to forget that during our founding, it wasn't the atheists or the civil libertarians who were the most effective champions of the First Amendment. It was the persecuted minorities. It was Baptists like John Leland who didn't want the established churches to impose their views on folks who were getting happy out in the fields and teaching the scripture to slaves. It was the forebears of the evangelicals who were the most adamant about not mingling government with religion. Moreover, given the increasing diversity of America's population, the dangers of sectarianism have never been greater. Whatever we once were, we are no longer just a Christian nation. We are also a Jewish nation, a Muslim nation, a Buddhist nation, a Hindu nation, and a nation of non-believers. It does seem to me that religious liberty has to encompass both halves of that speech from President Obama. And at a time when 30 to 35% of millennials do not even consider themselves part of any religious tradition, I think this issue of religious liberty presents itself in a particularly complicated way. So I would urge us in talking about international religious liberty to remember these two models that President Bush on the one hand and President Obama laid out on the other. I just want to close with a couple of thoughts. I really would like us as a nation to put an end to religion and culture wars, or at least to abate them, at least to begin to have, at least we might begin to have some understanding of each other. And that's where, unlikely as it is for a columnist to talk about it, humility comes in. One of my favorite theologians, familiar to many of you, is Reinhold Niebuhr. My single favorite Niebuhrism, by the way, about our flawed human nature. He once said, although he being an honest person, he acknowledged he got it from someone else, original sin is the only empirically verifiable doctrine of the Christian church. And I'm afraid if you look around Washington or look around any other city, that lesson comes back to you over and over again. His other great aphorism, by the way, is that man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, and man's capacity for injustice makes democracy necessary. We have the capacity to aspire to democracy, but we need the protections of democracy and religious liberty because of our capacity to persecute and be mean and be intolerant. And so I think to end the religious and culture wars and to allow religion to flower in public life, we need to combine passion and humility. These virtues do not always come together, but they must. We need a passion for moving our nation out of a period in which public problems went unsolved and the possibilities of broad alliances were lost because narrow political imperatives triumphed over the idea of the common good. And we need humility to understand how prejudices of believers against unbelievers and of unbelievers against believers have obstructed our path and blur our vision. The final enigma of history, Reinhold Niebuhr wrote, is therefore not how the righteous will gain victory over the unrighteous, but how the evil in every good and the unrighteous in the righteous is to be overcome. I think we must realize that self-righteousness is the enemy of righteousness. I think it's the enemy of religious liberty, and that hope is the virtue on which faith and love depend. The paradoxes of religious faith are obvious. It can create community, and it can divide communities. It can lead to searing self-criticism, and it can also lead to pompous self-satisfaction. It can encourage dissent and conformity, generosity and narrow-mindedness. It can engender righteous behavior and self-righteousness. Its very best and very worst forms can be inward-looking. Religion's finest hours have been the times when intense belief led to social transformation, yet some of its darkest days have entailed the translation of intense belief into the ruthless imposition of orthodoxy. Now, I think the United States has a special mission to the world, if I may say that, because in our history, despite many outbreaks of prejudice and nativism, some of which we're seeing around us today, our history is largely a history of religion's role as a prod to social justice, to inclusion, and to national self-criticism. I always say that my own political views were changed and shaped when I was 15 years old in a religion class at my Catholic high school. And we had to pick a religious book to read and write a report on. And the book I picked was Strength to Love, that great collection of Martin Luther King's sermons. And for me, a kid in an almost entirely white factory town in Massachusetts, it opened a whole world to me about racial justice and social justice and what it means to be a Christian in this world. And I think that the King story, the story of the abolitionists, the story of the people who fought for social justice in the progressive era and after, is a very rich part of our story, as President Obama pointed out in that speech. The historian Richard Whiteman Fox has noted that religion can be seen both as a democratic social power, a capacity to build community, and as a tragic perspective that acknowledges the perennial failing of human beings to make community endure. Religion, Fox continued, allows people to grapple with the human mysteries that neither science nor politics can address, but it also provides a force that science and politics can call on in their effort to understand and transform the social world. For that reason, I think religious liberty, arguments about religious liberty, and the fight for religious liberty will always have a great deal to do with our American experiment, and it ought to shape what we feel are our obligations as Americans to the entire world. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. And we're going to open the floor to a few questions. If you can go to one of those mics.
By the way, I always like to say I love dissenting questions. I spent my whole life practically arguing with a very, very conservative uncle of mine. And when he passed away, his kids very kindly asked me to do the eulogy in church. And in my eulogy, I made a point of quoting Richard Nixon. Now, there happened to be a Nixon line I liked that he took from, sort of elaborated from Teddy Roosevelt about the man in the arena, but I looked at everyone in the church and said, actually, I quoted Nixon because I thought if Uncle Ray heard me quote Nixon, he would rise up out of that casket just to tell me, I knew you'd be quoting Nixon someday. So I want to encourage dissent. Go ahead.
Yes, I will phrase this as a question at the end. I'm very concerned because it seems what we have is a feeling of grievance in the population at large. And this seems to be spreading particularly also in the Christian community. And I read in the paper recently that Donald Trump will be meeting in June with a number of Christian leaders at which they will, I presume, negotiate some kind of agreement of some kind. Can you reassure me that this sense of grievance will not develop into a genuinely intolerant religious movement?
I think the honest answer is no. I wish I could. I think your point about grievance is well taken. My old thesis advisor, Nathan Glazer, once wrote a book called We're All Multiculturalists Now. And I think that it is quite striking that each of us, in coming to the public square, many groups sort of use a language which is designed to say our rights and only our rights are being trampled, and therefore we should have special attention paid to us. I think one of the many fascinating things about this primary campaign is a split among religious conservatives of a sort we have not seen before. Religious conservatives have often been divided in their preferences, but it's not as if there was a deep split between, say, supporters of Ted Cruz or supporters of Marco Rubio, whereas when you saw which Christian conservative leaders repaired to Trump and which repaired somewhere else. I think it really was a difference in kind, that the religious conservatives who were anti-Trump paid a lot of attention not only to the way he had lived his life, but also in the case of Russell Moore, Russell Moore was very upset with the way Trump talked about race, immigration, Islam, and felt very strongly that this is not the kind of candidate a religious conservative ought to be supporting. On the other side is a view that Christians, and the pastor of the First Baptist Church down in Dallas, I think represents this pretty well, is the view that Christians are being driven out of the public square. It's amazing how often Trump likes to say, under my administration, you'll be able to say Merry Christmas, as if you can't say Merry Christmas now, as if somehow we should take great satisfaction out of potentially offending somebody by saying Merry Christmas. On the Christmas issue, by the way, if I may interject, there was one day when Charles Krauthammer, who, as you know, is Jewish, and I had dueling columns on the op-ed page, and I thought it was great for American religious pluralism that Charles defended saying, the Jew defended saying Merry Christmas in public, and I, the Christian, said, why should we go out of our way to offend our brothers and sisters who aren't Christian? There was something in some deep sense wonderful about that juxtaposition here. But it's a resentment in a sense that America has been on the wrong path for at least 8 and maybe 30 years culturally. I must say I am in that camp that says that Make America Great Again is the wrong slogan, because it implies that the country isn't great now. It implies that the changes that our country has been going through are all bad, that we should be fearful, that we are more diverse than we used to be as a country. We had the same fears 100 years ago. People said about Italian Americans and Jews what they say now about Latinos and Muslims. It's something I don't think we should be afraid of. I think we should be proud of. But there is this sense of grievance out there. And as a liberal, I try to ask myself, are there ways in which, we may have contributed to this in some way? And occasionally I will think, well, maybe occasionally we have shown really a disrespect for conservative people of faith. And I've spent my life trying to fight against that, even though I'm not a conservative, because there can be forms of disrespect. William Jennings Bryan, we think of only in terms of what he said at the Scopes trial, and not at all in terms of what he, as a fundamentalist, nonetheless believed about social justice, inclusion, women's suffrage, and a whole series of other things. But in the end, I really worry that there's, I don't know what exactly liberals can do about this when you have a movement led by somebody who, against all the evidence, kept insisting that the President of the United States was not legitimately in office because he had been somewhere else, or born somewhere else, even when the birth certificate came out. So I am very disturbed by this, and as I say, as a progressive, I want us to do what we can to end this, reduce this level of grievance. But I am heartened that there are people within the conservative Christian religious community who are speaking up against this. My colleague Mike Gerson at the Washington Post is a good example. Pete Wehner is another person who has really said this is not the way to be Christian in public. And I think that their voices will continue to be heard, and I personally welcome them. Sir?
Nicholas Miller from Andrews University. I worked in Washington, D.C. during the 1990s, and I now live in rural southwest Michigan. And one of my great pleasures in life is listening to NPR as you and David Brooks discuss and debate the issues of the day. And debate I use in a way that there really is an exchange of ideas. And I recognize that since I left Washington, that the level of discourse has gone down considerably. And not only can not Democrats and Republicans seem to talk with each other, but they're even having difficulty talking within their own parties. And I wonder if there's some insight or advice or counsel you have. You and David have a very, it seems, strong relationship and are able to dialogue in a gentlemanly way. What can we do to return some of that to our larger civil discourse?
But it's very, very generous of you to say that. You clearly paid too much attention to Melissa's nice introduction. I thank you for that. I always feel like a bit of a hypocrite when I answer a question like this because, on the one hand, if you read my column on a regular basis, you see that I can get worked up, I can get angry. There are things I just did a little bit with what's the word? We use the likely Republican nominee for president. I can get passionate about things, and some of my conservative friends will say that was way too partisan of you. So I do not want to claim purity in this. I can be a sinner too. On the other hand, it does really bother me the extent to which we have lost some of the capacity we used to have for real dialogue across these lines. It's why I like to begin my Q&As with that story about my uncle, or the fact that I grew up in a very politically diverse extended family where every family Thanksgiving was a giant political argument. My godmother tried to put an end to it, and she realized that was hopeless in our family. But it was, but we never imagined that if we were arguing with each other, we stopped loving each other, and that it was possible to disagree quite passionately and still respect the fundamental integrity of the other person. And I also think that we don't read each other as much as we used to. We don't listen to each other as much as we used to. Now, I'm not one of those who believes that the web has completely cocooned us within our own views. Heck, I wouldn't get all those nasty emails if people who passionately disagreed with me were simply ignoring me. I'd much rather get the angry emails than have them ignoring what I write. But I do think that, technologically even, it's easier for us to close ourselves off. And I also think the way we've organized Washington has made it more difficult. People don't move their families here anymore. They don't have that great experience of, cheering for your kid and the other guy's kid at sidelines in a high school game, even if you are absolutely opposite in your politics. Some of the informal ways in which people build ties have broken down. I don't feel blessed very often by getting old. I always tell my kids one of the good things is you get to have old friends. But the other thing is I predate the time when everybody hated each other in Washington, so I still have conservative friends I can argue with on a regular basis. I think some of my younger colleagues are trying hard to recreate that, but I think we've created a climate in which it's harder to do than it used to be, and I hope we need to try to rectify that.
Okay, I think we're actually going to...
My name is Dionne. I just asked a very short question because your title is the role of the media in framing public policy issues. So I just wonder, nowadays, our public policy seems to have been wrong, and the middle class are shrinking. And people don't really have a lot of saying or comment or complaint and properly resolved. So in your opinion, how are we going to solve this problem?
Did I understand you correctly, or are you talking about the
Your
shrinking of the middle
policy-
class and the problem of inequality? Is that?
Problem of equality or our public policy doesn't seem to work. And so one of the reasons probably is people don't really have the speaking opportunity or comment and complaint are not properly resolved. So what do you think, how to improve this?
Thank you. If I could fully answer that, I would stand here and announce my candidacy for President of the United States. I appreciate the question very much. There are two things about that. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan once said, it was about debating the Great Society, and he said there are more successes than we would like to know. And I think when we look back at public policy over a long period of time, we've actually made our country better over a long period of time. We made our country better with civil rights laws and voting rights laws. We made our country better with Medicare. We made our country better with Social Security and the expansion over the years afterward. Even though lots of students are now under crushing debt and we've got to reform it, we made our country better with government student loan programs. More kids have access than they used to higher education. We need to do more. So one of the things I think we need to do is stop telling the story that everything I'm not criticizing you for this, I'm saying this is the collective story we have been telling ourselves, is that everything that we have tried hasn't worked. Well, that's simply not true. So I think on the one hand, we have to celebrate the success. On the other side, we have to acknowledge that the combination of globalization and technological change, plus the decline of unions and a lot of other things, have created this problem of inequality that's been growing in some ways since the mid-1970s, with a sort of a little bit of a break at the end of the 90s, but barely. We've been on this long path. And we do need to pay a lot more attention than we have to the people who have really had their living standards crushed by globalization and technological change. If there's anything good that can come out of the Trump campaign, in my view, it's paying attention to those folks who have been hurt so hard, and Bernie Sanders has been talking about this too. But I want to close on this, and it does go to this theme of how can we come together, because there are actually two groups of Americans who have been very badly hurt by these changes, and one are working class, largely white, largely men. Working class white men have really been hit very hard by this, and we see that in towns in Pennsylvania and in Ohio, my hometown of Fall River, Massachusetts, where unemployment hit 15% during this recession. But the other people who've been hurt very badly are African Americans in the inner city. Years ago, William J. Wilson, the great sociologist at Harvard, wrote a book called When Work Disappears. And this has had these economic changes, which we haven't acted on quickly enough, have had a devastating impact on the inner city. Now, I am looking, when I was young, Robert Kennedy was assassinated, and many of us who admired him saw him as someone who could talk across these lines of race and of class. And I actually would like to see President Obama do this in the last 6 months of his terms, because I think he's got it in him to do it. But we need political leadership that brings these two groups together, because on the one side, one of the most disturbing reports that we've seen in the last year was the report of the rising suicide rate among older men, sort of 45 to 60, and I think some of that has got to be part of this economic pressure that they've been under. But the other big news story has been about the revolt in inner cities against unequal policing and against conditions that people there find unacceptable. As a country, we got to learn how to talk across these divides. Whenever we have managed to do that in our history, we've been a model to the world. Our civil rights movement was a model to civil rights movements around the world. That's the America that I think we want to be at the work of recreating over and over again, and I still believe that we are a country that has the capacity to do that. Thank you all so very much.